What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. It's Ryan here on the Max Afterburner channel. I'm a former F-15E combat fighter pilot, former F-16 Thunderbird pilot, and I've flown Boeing 737s and Airbus A220s as an airline pilot for years. And today I want to break down one of the largest single rounds of strikes we've seen yet in this conflict, a wave that reportedly hit somewhere around 170 targets across Iran. This came after Iran attacked shipping in the Strait of Hormuz, and I want to walk you through what actually got hit, why the strait keeps being the flashpoint for all of this, what a strike package on this scale actually looks like operationally, and then give you my honest read as a pilot on where I think this is heading. So my goal today is a few things. First, I want to lay out what we actually know about this round of strikes, because a number like 170 targets sounds huge, and it is, but I want to explain what that actually means in practice rather than just repeating the headline. Second, I want to walk through the broader context of why the Strait of Hormuz keeps being the trigger point for these escalations, because I don't think that gets explained well enough in a lot of the coverage. And third, I'll give you my honest opinion on what a strike of this scale signals about the direction this war is heading and what I think happens next. Let's start with the basics of what set this latest round off. This whole conflict, if you've been following along with me, kicked off back at the end of February when the US and Israel launched a coordinated set of strikes against Iranian nuclear infrastructure and military leadership. Iran's response at the time was to shut down the Strait of Hormuz entirely to shipping. And that set off what's become an ongoing crisis in and around the strait that has run for months now. There was a brief period where the US and Iran actually signed a preliminary agreement aimed at ending the fighting. But about a week after that deal was signed, an Iranian drone slammed into a cargo ship transiting the strait. And that single attack kicked off a chain of retaliation that has essentially unwound the entire agreement and put both countries back on a path toward full-scale war. So this most recent wave of roughly 170 targets came specifically in response to renewed Iranian attacks on vessels moving through the strait. From what's being reported, this round of strikes has expanded beyond just the coastal areas around the strait itself, hitting targets further inland, and even reaching into northern Iran, well away from the water. Central Command has described these strikes as being aimed at Iranian command centers, air defense sites, missile and drone capabilities, and coastal surveillance facilities, all of it framed around the goal of degrading Iran's ability to threaten commercial vessels and mariners moving through that waterway. Reporting has also described strikes hitting bridges and power stations further south, including one strike that reportedly collapsed a tower that had been used by Iran's Revolutionary Guard for maritime surveillance at one of the country's main ports. Iranian officials have said that just since hostilities resumed after that preliminary deal collapsed, dozens of people have been killed and several hundred wounded. Let's talk for a second about why the Strait of Hormuz specifically keeps being the center of all of this, because if you don't spend a lot of time thinking about maritime geography, it might not be obvious why this one relatively narrow waterway has become the flashpoint for an entire war. The strait is one of the most important choke points for global oil shipping in the entire world. An enormous percentage of the planet's seaborne oil exports pass through that narrow channel between Iran and Oman. When Iran closed it off and started deploying mines, drones, and fast attack boats to deter ships from transiting, that had an immediate and massive impact. We're talking well over 100 tankers stranded in the Gulf at one point, unable to move. That is exactly why the US has kept coming back to strikes specifically targeting Iran's naval assets, coastal surveillance, and drone and missile capability in that region, because from Washington's perspective, keeping that strait open is treated as a matter of both economic necessity and a direct test of whether Iran can be allowed to hold global shipping hostage. I also want to mention the naval blockade piece of this, because it's connected. After earlier negotiations failed to resolve things, the US actually imposed its own naval blockade on Iran, intercepting vessels trying to move in and out of Iranian ports. Reports have put dozens of vessels intercepted under that blockade, with a handful of ships actually seized, and the economic cost to Iran from that blockade alone has been estimated at hundreds of millions of dollars a day. So you've got this incredibly tangled situation in and around the strait right now, Iran trying to choke off shipping to pressure the West, the US running a counter-blockade to choke off Iran's own trade, and continuous strikes hitting the military infrastructure both sides are using to enforce their version of control over that waterway. Now let's talk about what a strike package hitting 170 targets in a single push actually requires operationally, because I think this is where my background is useful to you. Striking that many targets isn't one big formation of aircraft flying in together. It's an enormously coordinated multi-wave campaign involving strike aircraft, electronic warfare support, tankers, and almost certainly standoff weapons like cruise missiles launched from ships and submarines in addition to aircraft-delivered munitions. Targeting a number that large means the planners had to prioritize and sequence hits across command centers, air defense sites, radar and surveillance infrastructure, and mobile systems like missile and drone launchers, all while trying to make sure earlier strikes in the sequence don't tip off the enemy in time for them to move or hide targets scheduled to be hit later in the same operation. That kind of sequencing and deconfliction, making sure your own aircraft and munitions don't interfere with each other while hitting that many locations, some of them probably close together, some of them spread out across the entire country, is an enormous mission planning challenge that takes an incredible amount of intelligence work well before a single weapon is ever released. I also want to point out that hitting air defense sites specifically, which has clearly been part of this package, is usually one of the first priorities in a campaign like this, because until you degrade the other side's ability to track and engage your aircraft, everything else you're trying to do gets riskier. That's likely part of why we've seen these strikes described as hitting command centers and air defense sites alongside missile and drone infrastructure. You're not just trying to destroy Iran's offensive capability against shipping, you're also trying to make it safer for your own aircraft to keep operating in that airspace on subsequent nights of strikes. Let's talk about the human cost here too, because I don't want this video to just be about hardware and tactics. Reports have put Iranian casualties from this recent round of hostilities at dozens killed and several hundred wounded just since the preliminary deal broke down. There's also been an ongoing search for an American pilot who went missing during this stretch of the conflict, and Trump has publicly given Iran a short deadline, something in the range of 48 hours, to reopen the strait. These are real people on both sides of this, aircrew whose families are waiting on word about their safety, and civilians in Iran dealing with strikes hitting infrastructure like power stations and bridges, in addition to purely military targets. Whatever you think about the broader strategic picture here, I think it's important to keep that human dimension in view rather than just talking about target counts and munitions. Let me give you my honest opinion here as a pilot who has flown in combat environments, because I think this is where I can add something useful beyond just repeating the news. A strike wave hitting something like 170 targets in a coordinated push is a serious escalation. That is not a small punitive response. That is closer to what you'd expect from a full-scale campaign aimed at systematically dismantling a country's ability to threaten a specific piece of geography, in this case, the Strait. When I see reporting that these strikes have expanded beyond the coastal areas into northern Iran and are now hitting infrastructure like bridges and power stations, in addition to purely military sites, that tells me the target set has broadened considerably from where it started. Early in a conflict like this, strikes tend to stay narrowly focused on the specific military capability causing the immediate problem. In this case, ships and drones threatening the strait. When you start seeing power infrastructure and transportation infrastructure show up on target lists, that usually signals a shift toward trying to degrade the broader capacity of the country to sustain its military effort, not just neutralizing the specific assets involved in the strait attacks. I also think the scale of this specific wave, 170 targets in one coordinated push, suggests that whoever is planning this had already built up a substantial target list over time and was waiting for the right trigger to execute it all at once, rather than this being an improvised response assembled in just a day or two. Target lists like that get built through weeks or months of intelligence gathering, and executing against 170 of them in a single coordinated wave takes an enormous amount of pre-planning. That tells me this was likely already prepared well in advance, and the renewed drone attack on shipping simply provided the trigger to execute a plan that had already been sitting ready. Let's talk about where I think this goes from here. Given that Trump has publicly given Iran a short deadline to reopen the strait, and given the scale of the target list that's already been executed against, I think the most likely near-term path is continued and probably escalating strikes if Iran doesn't visibly back down within that window. Deadlines like that, especially short ones measured in hours rather than days, tend to be either genuine ultimatums backed by a plan that's already staged and ready to execute, or they're a form of pressure meant to extract concessions without actually following through. Given everything else we've seen in this conflict, the buildup of forces in the region, the scale of this particular strike wave, and the pattern of this war repeatedly reigniting every time a ceasefire or agreement gets reached, I lean toward thinking this is a genuine ultimatum rather than empty rhetoric. But I want to be honest that I can't know that for certain. Nobody outside the room where these decisions get made really can. I also want to talk about the broader pattern we've seen throughout this entire conflict, because I think it's instructive here. Every time there's been some kind of diplomatic progress, whether that's a ceasefire, a preliminary agreement, or a pause in strikes, something has happened within a fairly short window that unravels it. Whether that's a drone attack on shipping, a strike that kills American troops, or some other flashpoint that both sides seem to treat as justification for resuming hostilities at an even higher intensity than before. That pattern makes me skeptical that this current round of strikes, even if it's followed by some kind of new negotiation attempt, actually represents a lasting turning point rather than just the latest cycle in a conflict that keeps escalating every time it looks like it might be winding down. I want to touch on one more thing before I wrap up, which is the economic dimension of all of this, because I think it's easy to lose sight of just how much this specific fight over the Strait of Hormuz matters to the entire global economy, not just to the countries directly involved. With well over 100 tankers stranded at various points during this crisis, and a naval blockade costing Iran hundreds of millions of dollars a day, the ripple effects of this conflict extend into fuel prices and shipping costs all over the world. That's part of why you've seen so much international pressure and mediation attempts throughout this conflict. This isn't just a regional dispute. It's directly threatening one of the most critical arteries for global energy supply, and that gives essentially every major economy in the world a stake in how this resolves. So here's my bottom line. A strike wave hitting around 170 targets in a single coordinated push is a major escalation, not a routine retaliatory strike. And the fact that the target set has apparently expanded to include infrastructure like power stations and bridges alongside purely military sites tells me the overall campaign is broadening in scope. Combined with a short public deadline for Iran to reopen the strait, and combined with the repeated pattern we've seen throughout this entire war of every diplomatic opening collapsing within days or weeks, my honest assessment is that we are more likely heading toward continued and probably intensifying strikes in the very near term rather than a genuine resolution. I hope I'm wrong about that. I think everybody watching this conflict on every side of it would prefer to see this end through negotiation rather than continued destruction. But based on the pattern we've seen so far, I don't think we should expect that outcome without at least one more significant round of escalation first. I will absolutely keep you guys updated as this continues to develop, because with a deadline this short already in play, I expect we'll know a lot more about which direction this goes within the next few days. What do you guys think? Do you think Iran actually backs down and reopens the strait within that window? Or do you think this leads to another major round of strikes? Let me know down in the comments. I read every single one of them. If this helped you understand what's actually driving this latest round of strikes, go ahead and hit that like button for me, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next update, and follow me on X and Instagram, where I'm posting on this pretty much daily as it develops. Links in the description below. And go ahead and check out the video right here. I think you'll enjoy it. This is Ryan, also known as Max Afterburner, also known as the fighter pilot next door, signing off.